A couple people asked me if I could make a video about VKB software, so I'm going to be doing that right now. I'm not going to be going over absolutely every single feature of the software, but I'm just going to be kind of going over the basics so you can see how it works and so you're not confused. Now I've actually deleted the software from my computer so I can start from the beginning. So here we go. First thing you need to do is go to VKB's website and click the downloads button. So you don't need to download all this stuff. You only need to download 3 things. So first is VKBDevCfg. This is the actual software. The next thing is Z bootloader. This is for updating the firmware on your joystick. And the next thing is the device firmware up here at the top. This is how you get the latest firmware that they release. The last thing that I'd recommend downloading is this right here, the VKBDevCfg manual. So if you ever want to find out something, you can just reference that. I'm going to download it right here. Alright, so you've downloaded everything you need to. Now all you got to do is go to your downloads section. And you can see we have our 3 things here. So I'm going to bring these all to my desktop. And first thing I'm going to do is extract VKBDevCfg. So here it is right here. I'm going to extract the bootloader now. And you can see right here, this is the firmware kit. I'm going to make a folder and extract all the files into here because there's like a million files. I spelled that wrong. And you can see all the different firmware files here for all the different joysticks. Alright, the first thing we need to do is change some settings. So by default, you don't have access to everything in the software, and you really want to have access to everything. So first open the DevCfg program, and you can see, okay, close it, and you can see it, once you open it for the first time, it creates this file here, zconfig. So you need to open this file, and we just need to add a few lines so we can get access to everything. So the first thing you should do is scroll to the bottom and find user, and make a new line under user and type user equals developer. The next thing you want to do is find this right here, partial right equals 0, change that 0 to a 1, and see partial calibration equals 0, change that 0 to a 1. All we got to do is add 2 more lines, come up here to the top where it says common, make a new line under common, and I actually forgot what it was, but I have it right here at the manual. It's, oh yeah, it's test miscellaneous enabled equals 1, and the other line is use matrix equals 1. So just to make sure you got everything, let's go over real quick. You need to add user equals developer, partial right equals 1, partial calibration equals 1. That's all under the user section. And then all under the common section, you need to add a use matrix equals 1 and test miscellaneous enabled equals 1. All right, we can save this now. Click File, Save. And the last thing we do before we can get started with the software is update the firmware. So you can update the firmware by double-clicking this here, Z bootloader 2, and you can select your device. Right here, it'll list all your VKB devices. Here's mine right here, the Gladiator NXT. I'm going to double-click on that. All right, my NXT is selected. Now I need to select my firmware. So click here and locate the file where locate the folder where you put all your firmware in, and find your joystick. So this is all that stuff that we just downloaded earlier. So I'm going to find mine, the Gladiator NXT, and you can see firmware version 2.09. So I'm going to open that, and I'm going to click Flash to flash it onto my microcontroller. And it should take about 30 seconds. Now I've actually already updated mine, but I'm just doing it again to show you how it works. And the other thing is, if you just got a brand new VKB device, you probably don't actually need to do this. It's probably already updated, but if yours is like 1 or 2 years old like mine, then you probably need an update. So I'm just going to wait for it to update here. All right, you can see it's done updating. Now it'll close itself, and that's it. So now we changed the settings we wanted to, we updated the firmware, now we can get started with the tutorial. So here's the actual program, VKBDevCfg. So when you open it, it's going to look like this. There's going to be a blue box at the top, and this is where you select the controller that you want to work on. I want to work on the VKB Gladiator NXT, which is my joystick, and you can see right here it'll tell you the firmware version that it has right now, version 2.09, because I just updated it. I'm going to click on it. It'll take a second to load it, and get everything set up. All right, there we go. Now this software is split into two parts. There's like a bottom section and a top section. The top section is kind of like the toolbar, and the bottom section is kind of like where you set everything up, where you change all the settings. Let's look at the top section first. The top section has 3 tabs: Action, Tools, and Settings. I'm going to look at the Action tab first. First, you have this on the left. This just tells you which microcontroller is in your joystick. Mine has the VKBDevCfg microcontroller. Right here is the restart button. If you do this, it'll basically just disconnect your controller and reconnect it. So I'm going to restart mine right now. So basically what the restart button is for is like if your joystick's having problems or something weird's happening, you can just try clicking restart and see if it'll fix it. Okay, now the get and the set buttons. These are probably the 2 buttons you're going to be using the most. So whenever you make a change, like if let's say I change the color of the LEDs, or I change one of the settings on the buttons, whenever you make a setting on the software, that doesn't automatically change it on the joystick. You need to write that setting into your joystick, and you do that by clicking the set button. Now the get button is the exact opposite. If I plug my joystick into my computer, and the settings on my joystick are for some reason not the same as the settings on the software, I can click get, and my computer will read all the settings from my joystick and adjust the software accordingly. So just in case you didn't understand, for example, let's say I come here and this LED is yellow and I want to make it, I don't know, I want to make it purple. Whenever I change it purple, it's not going to change purple on my stick. I need to actually set it that way. So I click set, and now you can't see it, but when I look at my controller in real life, now the LED is purple. Alright, so the save and load buttons are for saving and loading custom files. So let's say I play multiple games, DCS, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I don't know, Elite Dangerous, and I have different setups for each game. Let's say I come in here and I set up all my settings I want for DCS, then what I'd do is I'd click save, and I'd type DCS and save it somewhere, and that's my DCS file. And now let's say I want to make a setup for Elite Dangerous. I'd set up everything I'd set up everything here for how I like it with Elite Dangerous, and then I'd click save, and I'd save my Elite Dangerous file. And then whenever I want to start gaming, I would click load. I'd find the file that I want to play. Like if I want to play DCS, I'd find my DCS file, open it, and then I'd click set, and I'd set those settings into my joystick. So that's what the save and load buttons are for. Let's look at the Tools tab now. You're probably not going to use these that much, but I'll go over the more common ones. The default button will set all your settings back to default. So this is for like, let's say you messed up a bunch of stuff and you don't know what you did. Just click default, it'll fix everything. The bootloader will just open this program we were here earlier, ZBootloader 2. The bootloader button's just a way to open it inside this program. The calibrate buttons, these are used for calibrating the axes on your joystick. Now you're probably going to need to do a calibration the first time you get your stick, and to do it, it's very simple. You just click Start Calibration. This will pop up, and you can select the axes you want to calibrate. I'll just select all of them. Click Set. And now all you need to do is move every axis on your joystick to its extreme position, which is what I'm doing right now with my joystick. And then click End Calibration. And now your joystick is calibrated. The Cancel Calibration button is if you're in the middle of a calibration and you mess it up, you can just cancel it. So you don't need to calibrate it every time, just like the first time you get it. The button wizard, the registry file, the parking, you're probably never going to use that. The device report will just like kind of make a PDF thing of all your settings. You're probably never going to need that either. The main things you're going to be using here is default and the calibration buttons. And once again, I'm not going to be going over every single thing. Now the settings tab is just for some settings. So the auto read parameters, so if you have this selected, then when you plug your joystick into the software, it will automatically read all the settings in your joystick, and it'll set the software up accordingly. If I have this deselected, then whenever I plug my joystick in, I gotta come here and I need to click get, so my software can get all the settings in my joystick to know what's going on. The set after load, so So there's set after load. So whenever I have this selected, that means that whenever I come here and I load a file, like let's say I load my Elite Dangerous file, or I load my DCS or my Microsoft Flight Simulator file, then right after loading it, it'll automatically write all those settings into my joystick. If I have this deselected, then after I load the file, it'll change the software, but I'm going to have to click Get to manually write it into my joystick. The partial write, so if I have this selected, then whenever I come here and I click Set, it'll ask me what settings I want to set. Do you just want to set your LED settings, your button settings, your axes settings? If I have this unselected or deselected, then whenever I come here and click Set, it'll just set everything. Partial calibration is similar to partial write. If I have this deselected, then when I come here to calibrate my joystick, it'll automatically assume that I want to calibrate every axis. If I have this selected, then when I come here and do a calibration, it'll ask me which axis do I want to calibrate. Skin here is just for changing how the software looks, so if you click standard, it just makes everything white. But in my opinion, this dark metro looks a lot better. So in summary, with this top section, you're probably going to want to use restart, the get and set buttons, the load and save buttons, the default button, and the calibration buttons. The other stuff you're probably not going to use that much. All right, now let's go over the bottom section. The bottom section is split into these 5 different tabs. And some of these tabs have sub-tabs. You can see test here. It has these sub-tabs at the top where I can go into even more stuff. So let's start from the easiest one first. The info tab just gives you information about your joystick. So you can see mine here is the VKB Sim Gladiator Next. I have the Pro version, firmware version. It just kind of gives you information. This is pretty straightforward. The test is just for testing stuff. So if I start clicking buttons now, you can see them all start lighting up. If you had some POV hats programmed, you could test these on the right. If I click axes up here, this is for testing all my axes. External devices tab will just show you which VKB devices you have plugged in. And miscellaneous is for testing the LEDs. All you have to do is type in the LED you want to test here. If I want to test LED 0, I can put LED 0, and you just hold down this button, and that LED will flash on your joystick. If I want to test LED 10, I can type 10, hold it, and now LED 10 is flashing. Now, one thing to note, different devices have different amounts of LEDs. So for example, my stick, the Gladiator NXT, has 3 LEDs. I have LED 0, LED 10, and LED 11. But different devices will have different stuff. So you might have to look up which LEDs your device has. Another thing is that the manual says that after testing your LEDs, you should restart the joystick. I'm not sure why, but it says you should do that. So I'm going to restart it now. This thing on the right, so let's say I want the LED to be a specific color when I test it. So for example, when I test LED 10, by default it flashes white. But let's say I want it to be flash red when I test it, then I can come here and click red and click OK. Then now whenever I come down here and select it, then now when I come down here and test it, it'll flash red. So that's the test and the info tab. Those are probably the simplest tabs here. Let's take a look at the global tab next. This is where you come to adjust global settings for your joystick, and by global settings, I just mean settings that affect the whole stick. So this has 2 subtabs, common and external. I'll go over common first. The common tab is where you adjust stuff like for example, this here button. How many buttons do you want the joystick to have? How many POV hat switches do you want? I'll put it down to 0. So you can see right here, I have 3 POV switches. I change it to 0, click set. Come back here to test, and now you can see there's none. I'd recommend leaving most of these defaults. This stuff over here, like tempo time, this has to do with the different button settings. If you want to learn about what that is, you can look it up in the manual, but I'm not going to go over all this because it'll take too long. The keyboard down here is if you want to enable a virtual keyboard, you can do that here by choosing classic or modified. So you can have it where a button on your controller, you can set it to, it'll click a specific button on the keyboard. And the rest of the settings are kind of straightforward. The mouse is for a virtual mouse, and yeah. The external tab here, first let's look at this external devices tab. This is where you adjust all the settings for the microcontroller. For example, speed here. I'm going to be honest, I don't know that much about microcontrollers. This is all like really technical stuff. So unless you really know what you're doing, you probably shouldn't mess with this tab. The LEDs tab here is one you're probably going to be messing with a lot. This is where you change all the LED settings. So how this tab works is you have these different events, event 1, 2, 3, 4. And what you do is you select the event, and the event is basically what causes the LED to come on. And you choose your color and your mode and which LED. So for example, 0 event just means the LEDs will always be on unless something else changes it. So I have 0 event for LED 10. I want it to be constant and color purple. So right now, LED 10 on my joystick is always purple. Another one down here, logical button. This means that whenever I click a certain button, my LED will change color. So under this here, OP1, I clicked 10. So whenever I click logical button number 10 on my joystick, then LED number 10 will light up yellow. And obviously you can't see it, but I do it right now and it works. One thing to note is that every joystick is different, but on my joystick, for example, it only has one RGB LED. The other ones are just red and blue. So if I want to adjust LED, if you want to adjust the color of an LED here, for example, if I want to try to make LED 0 green, I come here and change it. I can't do that because this one is only blue. And you can see there's a ton of different events here. Obviously, I'm not going to go over every single one, but hopefully you understand how this works. If you have any question about this, you can leave a question in the comment. So the last two tabs is profile and macro. I'll go over profile first. So profile is where you change all the settings. So axes, buttons, POV, and Boolean. This is probably where you're going to be spending the most time. So let's look at axes first. So VKB software splits axes into two different types, physical axes and logical axes. Physical axes is basically like the raw data from your joystick, and logical axes is like what Windows sees, or what DCS sees, or what Microsoft Flight Simulator sees. So on the bottom horizontal column here, you can see it says physical axis. I can also click response curve here, and I'll go over this in a second. This is where you change all the settings for the actual physical raw axis input. So you can choose the type of sensor. I'd leave this at default. If you change it, it's going to mess it up. You can choose if you want a virtual trimmer, and you can change all these settings here. Auto calibration. You can invert the axis if you want to. You can read up on this if you want to. These settings over here, the bias will change where the center position is. You can change the high and the low positions. Dynamic filtering, like this is where you change all the settings for the physical axes. Response curves here is where you change the curves for your axes. So most modern simulator games will let you change the curves in game, but if you're playing a game that doesn't let you do that, you can, let's say I want to change my curve for axis 2. I click on it, and then I come here, and I can change all my curves how I want to, and blah, blah, blah. So you get it. Now, one thing to note about the curves, if you want to have the curves always on, then you need to come here. Like if I change the curves for axis 2, let's say I don't know. Let's say I do something weird like that. If I always want axis 2 to have these curves, I can come here and click EQ. And that means axis 2 will always have those curves applied. If you don't want these curves to be always applied, then if you deselect EQ, then by default the curves will just be a straight line like normal. And you can change some settings in the button section to where if you click a button, it will apply a certain curve. And there's a bunch of different stuff you can customize. But I'm not going to get too much into detail because I don't want to make this video super long. All right, let's look at this top section here, this top horizontal column. This has two sections, logical axes and axes to buttons. Logical axes is for changing the settings for the logical axes, and the logical axes, like I mentioned earlier, is basically what Windows sees. So to try to explain this, let me see. Let's say, for example, I want to have my first logical axis to be the x-axis, then what I would do is I'd come here, I'd select x-axis, and I would need to find which physical axis is the x-axis on my joystick. Now, it just happens to be that the x-axis on my joystick is physical axis number 1. So what I'd do here is I'd come here to axis ID and I'd select number 1, if that makes sense. I'm not going to go over all these settings here. This is just more complicated stuff. I'd recommend honestly leaving all these settings at default. You can come here and invert it if you want to. Definitely keep these on, visible and enabled. But yeah, that's basically, this is where you come to adjust the settings for the logical axis. All right, now we can look at axes to buttons. This is for setting it up where if you want to have, you can set up certain zones to where whenever when your joystick axis crosses a zone, it activates a different button. For example, I have mine set up right now, zone edges 2, and that makes it where if I bring my joystick to one extreme, it activates one button, and the other extreme, it activates another button. You can choose which virtual button you want to activate. You can double click it and it'll open this menu and it'll show you which buttons are available. But I'm trying not to make this video too long, so I'm just gonna stop it there, and you can read more about that in the manual if you want. Alright, so this is the buttons section. Now you can see this is split into two sections, physical layer and logical layer. This is basically the same way the axes works, where there's physical buttons and logical buttons. So the physical layer is where you adjust your physical buttons. So let's say I want to adjust my trigger. So I click pull here and I pull my trigger, and you can see the red light will activate. So I can hover over the cell and I can see, okay, cell number 10 or physical button number 10 is what my trigger is connected to. So I can click on this and I can open it, and I can click this right here and I can adjust some settings. So by default, physical button number 10 is a button, but I can change it to button alternate. Or I can change it to shift or a temporary button, or there's just or I can have it no function to do nothing at all. You can read up on all these different things to see what they do, but this is basically where you change all the settings for the buttons. Now, whenever you're done setting up the physical button, you need to choose which logical button it activates. Now, if you have it set it to auto mapping, the physical button will activate. It is just the same logical button, so physical button 10 will activate logical button 10. But if I want to, I can change it. I can double click on this and come here, and let's say, okay, I want my trigger to activate logical button number 6 for some reason. I can click that, and I can click, whoops. Sometimes it randomly crashes for no reason, but that's not a big deal. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Let's go back to my trigger, and let's say for some reason I don't want my trigger to activate logical button 10. Let's say I want it to activate logical button 37. I can click that here, close, and I can set my settings. And you can see now that instead of activating logical button 10, my trigger will now activate logical button 37. So that's how the logical buttons work. I mean, that's how the physical buttons work. The logical layer is for adjusting the logical buttons. So whenever logical button gets activated, I can choose what I want it to do. It can be a regular button press if I want to, or it can be a press on a hat switch, or it can be a press on a keyboard button, or it could multimedia, and you could use it to play something, or you could do system and use it to shut down your windows, or you can do whatever you want. I don't know what you want to do. But that's basically that. In summary, the physical layer is where you come here to adjust the physical button. You can choose how you want it to function, and you can choose which logical button you want it to click. Then you just come over here and you choose what you want that logical button to do. The last thing that I want to go over is virtual buttons. Now, a virtual button is basically a fake physical button. So to demonstrate this, let's say I have a shifter right here. Let's come to my trigger. Now, let me just change this real quick so it makes more sense. Now, the way I have it set up right now is whenever I pull my trigger, which is physical button 10, it will activate logical button 79. Now, let's say I turn my shifter on. So the shifter will make it where if I have my shifter on and pull the trigger, it will activate a different logical button. So let's say I want my shifter to activate logical button 80. So with the shifter off, logical So with the shift off, logical button 79 will get activated, and with the shift on, logical button 80 will get activated when I pull the trigger. Now each logical button has to be activated by a physical button. For 79, it's no problem because it's being activated by my trigger. But for button 80, I need a virtual button. But for button 80, I can't use button 10 because. But for logical button 80, I can't use the trigger because I'm already using that for 79. So what I need to do is come over here and I need to choose a virtual button. So for example, virtual button 116. So virtual button it's just like it's pretending to be a physical button so I can activate the logical button, if that makes sense. I know this is really confusing. But right now you can see with the shifter off, I pull the trigger, it activates physical button 10, which turns on logical button 79. With the shifter on, when I pull my trigger, I need to change the settings first. But if I set the settings, with my shifter on, whenever I pull the trigger, it will activate virtual button 116, which will activate logical button 116. So that's virtual buttons, if that made any sense. Again, I know this is kind of confusing. I'm just trying to go over the basics here. If you have questions, just ask me in the comments section. Alright, now let's take a look at this Pov tab. So this is for changing your POV switches. So you can change the output if you want it to be a point of view hat or a numpad. You can change it if you want it to be 8-way, 4-way, 6-way. So for example, let's say I come back to buttons and I have a POV switch. Let's say I want this hat, click left, to be left on a POV. So I'd see this this right here activates logical button. Well, I actually already set it up. Let me do a different one. Let's say I click right on this hat switch on my throttle. On my stick. I can see this activates logical button 28. So I'd come over here to the logical layer. I'd find button 28, which is right here. And I'd say hat switch number 1, right on the hat switch, click set. And if I go to test, you can see I got my hat switch right here. And the POV section is just for changing the settings on that. So that's what that is. So this is the Boolean tab here. What you can do is just kind of set up like little functions. So let's say that I want to try this not one. I think I already have it set up. So whenever I have physical button 12 selected, it will activate virtual button 80. So I can come here and I can save that. So physical button 12, let me find where that is. That's my press button. So whenever I click this button, it will activate virtual button 80. And then I can go in somewhere and I can say, okay, virtual button 80 will turn on an LED or something like that. So that's what that is. Again, I'm not going to go too in-depth into this. The last thing to go over is the macro section. So if I come over here, I can set up macros. So I have a pinky button on my joystick. Let's say I want that pinky button to do a macro. So I click it and I find it. It's right here. That is logical button 80. So I'd come to the logical button. I'd find logical button 80, which is right here. And I'd say, okay, I want this to activate a macro. And I'll say macro number 5. Okay. So let me save that real quick. And now I can come over here to the macro section. And I can, for my next macro, I'll do macro number 5. And I can set up what it to do. Like, I don't know, let's say I wanted to click a button on my mouse, click right mouse button. And let's say I also wanted to click the A button on my keyboard. Then I can do that and I can click set. And then whenever I click that button on the side of my joystick, it'll activate that macro, which will activate all the functions that are in here. And you can adjust some settings for it here. So that's basically the basics of this software. Again, I didn't go over everything because I don't know everything and because it would take too long. Hopefully you know the basics. If that was confusing or you have questions, just ask me in the comment section and I'll help you. Thanks for checking out this video.